a.m. on April 14th, last day of CWA. My name's Andy Baker, and I'm Associate Professor of Political Science here at CU. I'm also Director of the Program on International Development in the Institute of Behavioral Science. And I think the reason I was chosen to moderate this panel is because I've conducted research on what people in developing countries, particularly Latin America, what they think about globalization and other economic policy issues. But you're, of course, not here to hear me. You're here to hear our panelists, who I'll introduce here as we go. I think all of you know the drill in terms of asking questions by now. So there's a CWA app, and that is by far the best way to submit questions. If you tap on the name of our panel and then tap on live Q&A, you can type in your question and I'll receive it up here, and I'll sift through those and ask some of them during Q&A time in the last third of the panel. You can also, if you don't want to use the app, can raise your hand, and one of our producers will come and give you a 3x5 card, which they'll then deliver to me, and we'll take those into account as well. But apologies in advance that we surely won't be able to read off every question. Okay, so let me introduce each speaker as they are going to talk. I won't introduce all four up front here. We're going to go in the order as they appear in the program. Our first speaker is Larry Greenwood. He's president of the Japan Society of Northern California. And one of the things I really like about the group of experts we have up here is there's a wide array, among just these four people, a wide array of expertise on the issue of trade that comes from business involvement, government involvement, and academic involvement on that issue. And so it's, you'll get a nice array of perspectives. Larry's involvement is that he has actually been involved in trade negotiations with the State Department. And so, Larry, if you could kick us off.
Great, thanks. Let's start by a little audience participation. So by show of hands, how many people here have lost their job in some point in their career to import competition? Okay, none, which is actually about right, because in this, I mean, if we had 300 of people here instead of about, 70, we probably would have had one or two if a representative of the United States more generally. Boulder's not, of course. If this was in Ohio, it would have been maybe 4 or 5, but still a relatively small number. But as you can imagine, losing your job to import competition would hurt a lot, and it's very acute pain. And now, by show of hands, how many people here are wearing clothing? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, okay, no, I don't see anybody, no nudists, and I'm not going to make any challenges to students. But, yeah, so obviously the benefits of trade are very dispersed among us all. I mean, basically you spend a couple of bucks less than you would have if it wasn't trade to buy what you're wearing today. And if you have one of these, you'd be spending even a lot more to buy one of these if we didn't have trade. In fact, you wouldn't be able to buy one of these because it has technologies from many countries that we don't even have in the United States. So, and that's the first factor I want to mention as to why why people are unhappy with trade, is that the pain is very acute, but it's focused and narrow. But in those places and those people, it's real, and they complain about it quite loudly. For those who benefit of trade, and which is pretty much everybody else, the benefits are widely dispersed, but maybe per person are obviously not as great as the cost per person of those people who lose their jobs. And that translates into politics. Loud voices tend to trump the quiet majority, and so loud voices get heard, particularly during an election. So talking about, as a trade negotiator, I never wanted to have an agreement come up for Senate approval during an election, and which is what we did in TPP, which was a big mistake. So because during elections you don't want to talk about trade because you're going to have a more protectionist bent. The second factor is that the government officials or politicians don't like to talk about the benefits of trade from an import point of view, the benefits that consumers get from imports. And why is not entirely clear to me, but when you look at all the statements that President Obama made about trade and TPP in particular, and I didn't read every single one of them, but I read most of them, There was very little, almost actually nothing that I can recall that he ever said about the significance of imports to American welfare in talking about that. And instead, the governments and administrations, and I was guilty of this, I wrote lots of talking points to get Uruguay around and NAFTA through the Congress in the 1990s, talking about all the great jobs, the job numbers we were going to create from trade agreements, and all the new jobs, and we had, frankly, highly inflated numbers. My economist came to me and said, Larry, you know this is BS, right? And I said, yeah, but we got to sell it that way. And so we basically have overpromised, we overpromised job creation. Now, free trade does have some, I believe, some small job creation impact, and most studies show that, but it's relatively small. Mainly what it does is it gives you higher paying jobs, so it does do that. It basically substitutes lower paying jobs for higher paying jobs. And that goes back to the pain and the politics of it, because it does create sometimes income inequality if you don't deal with the people who have lost their jobs. Third factor, scapegoating. So trade is the scapegoat for technological change that has been the major disruptive force in terms of employment in the labor market in the United States. And so, the pain that people are truly going through in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana most, and all the studies show this, is mainly the result of technology. It's automation in factories. Today, our level of manufacturing, that is the output in the United States, continues to grow. That's not shrinking. And our productivity in manufacturing continues to grow. What's happened, of course, is that the manufacturing employment is going down because our productivity is going up. So the output per worker goes up, but the number of workers is going down because we're substituting technology and automation. So it's an easy concept to understand economically, but again, politically fraud. So the result, but it's easier to blame foreigners on that problem than to deal with the problem domestically. So instead of talking about the real issue of technology and what that's done to us, and the adjustments we need to make, we just blame it on imports and those bad foreigners and Chinese and the forced labor and all that stuff. Not to say that forced labor, by the way, is not a problem. We have to deal with it, but that's not the reason. That's not a reason to stop trading. And then finally, the last reason I think we have that trade has become a negative political issue is because we haven't, as something I've already mentioned, we haven't adequately dealt with the adjustment that's required when we have this technological change, when we have an increase of trade. So this pain, as I said, is real, and it's also geographically concentrated and happens to be in states that are politically important because they tend to be battleground states. So but we haven't actually dealt with it. It wasn't dealt with, and neither candidate addressed this during the election. Obviously, Mr. Trump addressed it by saying we're not going to import anymore. We're going to cut imports, and that's the way we're going to bring your jobs back, which is obviously not going to happen. But no one actually addressed the real issue of, so how do you revive these communities that have been harmed by closing down factories, and where do you find jobs for them? We've had a failure for decades of our trade adjustment assistance programs. So that's the real issue. It hasn't been addressed. People are pissed off about it, and that's a real political issue. It's that the party who gets that right is going to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mike Cordon. He's President and Chief Operating Officer of Western Digital Corporation. And Mike's expertise lies on the business end of trade. His company engages in international manufacturing and tons of exporting and importing.
Great, thank you. I'm really going to segue off what Larry had to say. So I think obviously the rise of populism and sort of trade and the effects of it on sort of our local economies is obviously political red meat. We saw a lot of it in the election that just happened. But as Larry talked about, when we look at productivity gains and specifically technology, including automation, if you look at the output of the economy in the last 35 years, it's roughly doubled as those jobs have disappeared and gone away. But if you look at manufacturing as a percentage of GDP in the U.S., it's roughly half of what it was, again, about 25 or 30 years ago, but that tracks pretty closely to the global ratios. So when you think about what's generating GDP, it's less and less manufacturing on a global basis. So when we have to look at the broader trends and what's happening. For our company, it's clear companies spent about 20 or 30 years chasing low labor markets for heavy labor-intensive manufacturing. For us, it became very clear that was a losing battle over time. So we manufacture in China, Malaysia, Thailand, and if you think about one market in particular, China, that labor market is increasing at about 10% per year, labor rates. So the ability to think you're going to solve your manufacturing cost problems through moving to a low-cost labor market is no longer valid. So what we invest in, and we have a big factory outside of Shanghai, and it's lights out. So what do you have supporting that factory is a lot of engineers that support that equipment. And then that goes to sort of the broader issue, and we think about how we might solve some of these very real issues that exist in certain parts of our country using software as an analog. All areas in software and programming are not created equal. Many times, I live in Silicon Valley. Companies that are around me are companies like Google and so on. And we talk a lot about machine learning and AI, and that's neural network programming, very advanced. Certainly, those are sort of the cream of the crop in terms of capabilities. But if you think about maintaining manufacturing equipment and the software that does that, that's a whole different grade of activity. And that's the type of thing we need to retrain the workforce for. One program that I'll reference that I think is good in terms of a visionary program is Mark Benioff has talked about 5 million internships. And that's really about trying to get business involved in the retraining, and I think that's quite good. And we as a company are actively exploring how we do that. So I think some of the revitalization efforts are challenging because there's certain areas in the country, particularly in the Rust Belt, that have to, programs have to be generated to revitalize and retrain the workforce. But it's a big challenge, and I'll agree with Larry, something that's, whichever party gets it right is going to be successful. Thank you.
All right, you both made my job easy. You're keeping well under the time limit. Thank you. Our third speaker is Maggie Chen. She's professor of economics and international affairs at George Washington University. Maggie's a trade economist, and she has experience working in this capacity at the World Bank, and also she actually worked with the Congressional Budget Office and calculating some of the potential effects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Maggie?
Thank you. Thank you. So let me start by telling you about a randomized survey experiment I recently did among my students with the goal of trying to understand what determines people's preferences for economic policy, including trade policy. So the reason it's randomized is we want to make sure we are controlling for other factors like income and ideology and education. Obviously, these students have similar levels of education, right? So our goal is to understand the role of knowledge and information. So what we did was to provide different versions of a survey. So one survey would be given information about what kind of inequality trends we are seeing in the last 80 years, and how trade has led to the decline in manufacturing employment. Okay, so another survey would be showing the same figure of inequality by telling people that actually trade can lead to productivity growth and can lead to output growth. So basically, the positive things about trade. And then the control group would be the group that doesn't really, is not given any information about these negative or positive effects of trade. So how did the students respond to that? So as you would expect, the students who were told that trade can cost manufacturing jobs told us in the survey that they would like to have higher tariffs, higher quotas, especially on China, despite the fact that they are going to be graded by a Chinese professor, meaning myself. They had no problem expressing their feelings. So
Think about America.
I wouldn't do that to my professor, but in China. But so it's clear to us that controlling for all these other things, right? Household income, their ideology, which plays a role as well, of course. Their background, where they came from, where they grew up. Information and knowledge about how they think trade will affect the economy, including different groups, has a role in people's attitude towards globalization and the preferences for economic policy. So what we are seeing today in the United States is less about division between the left and the right. It's more about division between globalism and the nationalism, or even localism. The problem lies in the fact that our economy is becoming increasingly globalized, but our politics is very local. So that creates a conflict, right? So the question is why? Why are we seeing that division? Why are we seeing that growing tension between the the globalist group and the nationalist group? So there are many reasons, and Larry and Mike already mentioned many of them. The first one is, as Larry mentioned, the benefits of globalization, including lower prices, higher productivity, more varieties in consumption, are less visible, right? We all get a little bit of that, right? But the costs of globalization, including job loss, lower wages, are much more real and are more deeply felt, and they're very concentrated. So people, of course, react more strongly to the cost of globalization than to the benefits of globalization. And the second factor is politics. Whenever a country's economy is in turmoil, politicians would find it easier to point the fingers outward than actually look internally. Right? It's easier to blame somebody outside than look actually what's happening domestically, right? So what we're seeing is a reversal of what we have been doing in the past. We're basically redoing a lot of things, that we have accomplished in the last decades. We're seeing, the U.S. withdraw from TPP. We're seeing the possibility of renegotiating NAFTA. We're seeing Brexit. Right? So we're redoing what we have been accomplished in the last 2 to 3 decades. And the third reason why people are still buying that rhetoric is there is actually lack of evidence, even though our instincts tell us that technological progress must play a leading role in the declining manufacturing employment. But there's actually not that much evidence out there until recently. So economists, Darren Acemoglu and his co-author recently had a working paper that just came out that shows that he was looking at robots. Obviously, the issue is not just about robots, about automation and algorithms and all these other things. His evidence shows that every additional robot per 1,000 workers would replace 6 workers, right? So is that more effective than Chinese workers? Probably so. Right? Yes, we might be able to build a war on Mexico or even on China. We don't need a war on China. But can we build a war on California, right? Sorry, Mike. To stop them from coming and invading, our states and our jobs. That's probably going to be harder, right? So what are the other candidates or other factors apart from technological progress? Well, there are other things too. For example, our consumption structure is changing, right? Yes, we still wear clothes. Probably not, but but the share of that in our income is declining, right? We're spending more and more money on services, on this, right? We're spending our money on less tradable or high quality, high tech goods, which means there will be less demand for the traditional manufactured goods, relatively speaking, and less demand for the labor who is employed in those sectors, right? This is actually shown in one of the distinguished economics professors here, my former committee member on my dissertation. I actually came to CU Boulder for my PhD, Jim Markison. He recently has a paper showing that the demand changes have a lot to do, will actually affect the income inequality and job losses too. And there are other things, inequality in access to public goods, to education, right? And that leads to the so-called Great Gatsby curve. I don't know whether you have heard about that. The movie, The Great Gatsby. Basically, it's a low social mobility, right? The probability for our next generation to move up the income ladder, given our income level, is fairly low in the United States. It's difficult to change your situations because you don't have that access to education equally across the country that is instrumental for you to move up the social and income ladder. Right? So these are the factors here. And then the myths, there are actually a lot of myths about globalization. How seriously should we worry about trade deficits, aggregate trade deficit, bilateral trade deficits? Bilateral trade deficits in particular are overly stressed, right? I mentioned this example in my panel yesterday. Is it iPhone? Yeah, okay. For every, sorry, I have one too, but it's, it's easier to use Larry's. For every iPhone we import from China, we're going to run a trade deficit. Why? Because we export components from Silicon Valley to China. And China imports these components from the US, Japan, South Korea, Germany, assemble them, which is about $10 value of assembly services, and they export to the rest of the world. Of course, you're going to run trade surplus in China because you are exporting the finished good, right? You are the last stop of production. You are the end of the global value chain. So you are responsible for exporting all the finished goods. And our trade statistics are looking at the value of your exported goods, not the value added you generate in the good. The truth is only $10 out of these $200 when they leave China are generated in China. And Chinese workers actually only get like a couple of dollars out of it. The rest actually is accumulated by another multinational company in China, which is Foxconn. I'm not going to work for Foxconn in the future, so I can say that. But so the thing is, a lot of these actually are a result of the global value chains and the multinational behavior. Right? We run a huge trade deficit with China, often because of our own multinational firms are doing businesses in China. I'm not saying that's wrong, okay? I'm not saying that's wrong. I work on FDI all the time, and I actually, champion the benefits of FDI all the time. But that's just reality. So what do we do next? So I think what we should do next is actually look at domestically. Unfortunately, trade is something that if you stop, it's going to lead to a lot of consequences. Apart from economic consequences, we're going to see instability, social conflicts, national security problems. And so what we need is to supplement trade with domestic reforms. So I'm going to stop here.
All right, fourth and final speaker is
it's pronounced Jett.
Mark Jett, thank you. CFO and Deputy Chairman of the OAO Novatech company. And Mark his role is also on the business side. He sells sells hydrocarbon products all over the world. And I believe you're based in Moscow? So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to change the dialogue a little bit from what you just heard from the other panelists, because I think they did a very good job, and I don't think I can add much more to the current situation. But I think it's important to look at trade from a historical perspective. I mean, if we go back in history, whether we're looking at from the Silk Road, Marco Polo, the Dutch Indies, West Indies going to Indonesia, going to India for the spices. We have seen global trade, throughout history. The Roman Empire was built on trading among various entities. And I worked the last 22 years in Moscow, and we've essentially have gone from a barter economy to now a full-fledged market economy, in the Russian context of what a market economy is. But we do operate and sell products around the world. I do work in an oil and gas company, mostly natural gas. The oil and gas industry is a worldwide commodity traded product. And so we're kind of used to this type of environment. And I think as history goes through, whether we go from the agrarian to the industrial revolution to the information revolution to where we're headed in the future, there's always going to be this disruption in people's lives. And I think that's really where they misunderstand it. And I think part of this globalization question is just a lack of understanding of people about what the world and how what the world is and how the world operates. I mean, clearly through these changes, some of them is like we see today in the technology world, is extremely disruptive. And anything is disruptive, it's going to take a little period of time for the economy to absorb that. And I think as we look at the Rust Belt here, in America, we can see these same pockets of depression around the world. I mean, if you look at the global population today, we have almost 2.5 billion people that live on $2 or less a day, and global trade is one of the only things that are going to be able to keep these people from surviving. So we have to recognize that the fact that, we may not like it, as it displaces jobs on the current market, but in reality, we have to look at it also from a global perspective, because a lot of people are surviving today due to the very, very fact that we are able to trade amongst various countries, shift manufacturing as we've done, to the Asian markets. Now we're seeing, as Mike talked about, he mentioned, the cash. China for many, many years, one of the advantages of them was the low cash cost. And as Mike said, a 10% per annum, increase in the wage costs, people are then shifting to, Vietnam or Bangladesh. I mean, if you ever looked at, as Andy said, you look at your shirts and your clothes, how much do you see, manufacturing done in the United States? It's very rare. And so that's why people push that, made in the USA or made in England or something as a brand in itself. So I think global trade, it's necessary. There's obviously backlashes to it, and I think we see the protests every time we see a WTO session. It gets pretty crazy around some of the host cities. But the fact is that without it, products would not be shifting around the world. Goods that we take for granted today will not be able to be manufactured at an affordable price, as these panelists just discussed. But I think largely, what I like to see, and one of the things I think it's problematic in the trade agreements, and Larry probably can address this better than I can, is we have differences in currencies, and currencies play a big role in the manipulation of trade around the world. When you look at somebody manipulating their currency for exports, a lot of people, here again, it goes back to that question of education and understanding more, rather than being purely a myopic domestic view. If you look at it from a world perspective, people hear, oh, we have a strong dollar. That sounds great. That sounds great if you're going to go somewhere, travel, and you want to go, to Mexico. But the U.S. manufacturer trying to sell on a global market, that's negative. And I look even today when I'm here in Russia, and the sanctions that were placed by President Obama on the Russian economy, I don't think, we really truly understand from the American perspective that Russia doesn't really care too much about whether or not the sanctions are lifted immediately, because what it did, it devalued the ruble, which made Russia more competitive in the global markets. It dropped the cost down, so they're not in any hurry to see some of these conflicts resolved, because a change in the strength in the ruble would be negative for them at this particular juncture in the transition. Now, I go back a second. When I first moved to Moscow, we were in barter economy. People were transferring goods and services, and it was kind of difficult to work with somebody, because you're trying to get a particular services, and somebody's running to you to sell you chickens, and it doesn't work, because I don't eat chickens, but maybe somebody on the street eats chickens, and you're trying to value this thing, but the whole economy was essentially based on this types of transactions. And then when you removed yourself from that level of trading activity, then you went down to the underground, which was the black markets. And I think what we see today in the world, in many of these economies, many of these developing economies, where trade doesn't go above, where it's clear, you have all these black markets emerging, and we don't really understand sometimes what the extent of the economy is. So I just wanted to bring it from a historical perspective, saying that trade has been here from the beginning of time. And we have moved through various periods, and we seem to adjust through these periods, but there are disruptions, and there are changes, and there are needs to retool. And I think that's some of the things that we're seeing here in America today as part of the education process, is that we need to retool some of the training. We need to go back and look at it from an education perspective and see what are the technologies, what are the skill sets that people need to be competitive in today's marketplace. So with that said, I'd like to end it at this point. Thank you.
All right, so do feel free to start entering questions, and they'll show up on my phone here, and I will relay them to our panelists. If you are a student, mention that in your question. As you know, students get priority at CWA. But before we turn to questions, let me just take a couple of minutes and ask a few follow-up questions. So, all of you gave wonderful, spirited defenses of international trade. But just to play devil's advocate, none of you actually answered the question of the panel. The name of the panel is Why Has Public Opinion Turned Against Trade? Right? And a lot of you touched on this, right? It's clear there are losers from globalization. And so there's very clear theory, and it's very clear that there are losers from globalization, and those are the people who dislike trade. But if you really take this question literally, the question becomes, why has that occurred now? Why is it occurring in 2016? Why does Brexit occur in 2016? Why do we have Trump in 2016? Why didn't this stuff happen in the 1990s? NAFTA's 23 years old now. China has been engaged in global markets for 20, 30 years now. So why did all of this stuff take so long to become so hotly politicized? Any thoughts on that?
Let me just start. I guess one point I guess I would make is that it's not a new issue, and so we've had this before. The Seattle, anti-globalization demonstrations in the late 90s at the WTO negotiation were, of course, huge, and so that goes back to the 1990s. Bill Clinton, when he ran for president for the first time, ran on a semi-protectionist platform. He said he was going to bring jobs back from Asia. And I was in Singapore at the time, and with a bunch of expats who didn't want to go back to America. They were quite happy in Singapore. So it's not a brand new issue, but it does seem to be coming up more. And it's I think one of the factors, and also I guess I would say that Brexit, I believe, is actually much more about immigration than about trade. Although some of it was clearly some frustration with former steel workers and things of that sort, but I think mainly it was an immigration issue, because in fact the UK wants to maintain its economic integration with Europe, but without the immigration conditions, and they're very explicit about that desire. So I don't know if that's really the one driving it. Clearly here in America, that protectionist message resonated with a lot of folks, in part because we had a candidate who was just very brazen about doing that. It's the issue's been out there to exploit for many, I think, for many decades, but no one has had the whatever the word is, chutzpah, to actually to use that as effectively and as blatantly as Mr. Trump did, and effectively, I should say. So I think that's partly the reason we're seeing it now. And let me just one last reason. In some ways, this is a delayed reaction to what I call the China shock. And so Maggie mentioned some new academic research that's been done. There's also been a lot of research into exactly how has the increase of Chinese exports to the United States since their entry into WTO impacted the United States, and that has found that there's been a lot more disruption, particularly in communities in the Rust Belt, and much more lasting impact than we had initially thought. And so clearly there was a lot of impact, and this is now just kind of, I think this is kind of bubbling up now, 10, 12, well, not 15 years after that. So it's basically like all shocks, it takes a little time to really feel it. Ironically, or maybe not a good thing is that impact, of course, is now tailing off. We're not seeing an increase in Chinese exports to the United States. As Mike has noted, the costs are now actually getting closer. There's it's a narrower difference. So that shock effect also is we're not going to see so much of, which was a really unusual historical event, right? I mean, the explosion of China is a kind of once in a generation type of once in a 200 years kind of event, and we're not going to see that again. And so, maybe it's just that we're now just kind of feeling the shock and we're getting over it, and so maybe there's a glimmer of hope out there, but this is just the end of an adjustment that's been painful but is now going to be over.
I also think that when we look at society today, let's not lose the fact that social media plays an enormous role in gathering people together, whether it's political demonstrations, Black Lives Matters type movements, et cetera. And the same, I think, in sort of the opposition to some of these trade agreements. We have a lot of social activists, that agitate a lot of information, and I think maybe what you're saying today is part of the emergence as we see currently is that it's easier to gather people together under a common cause, but a lot of it also has been which we didn't I think discuss is wage stagnation. We have not seen any growth in wages here in America for almost a decade, and I think people eventually, as luckily for us, we don't see huge inflation, but people get concerned about this. And I think when you start looking at college educations, people coming in, not finding the jobs, having incurred debt, don't see a bright future, hear this news and these agitators out there talking about globalization, the ills of this through the social media platforms, you're invariably going to see more demonstrations and comments coming up. So I think social media plays a huge role in why we hear a lot of it today.
So yeah, I would like to add just some more statistics, for example. To me, it's not that surprising that the public is turning against trade at this point. If you look at the figure that I show my students, which is the income inequality trend, okay, you're going to see a U-shaped figure of income inequality. We are reaching a height of income inequality where 1% of our, top 1% of our population by income is accounting for almost 25% of national income, okay? And that is surpassing the historical high. The last time we reached that point was in 1930s, okay? So that, of course, is ultimately going to lead to a point that people just had enough. They had enough about their concerns, anxiety at their jobs and their income inequality, the increasing prices and lower real income. There will be a point that they are unhappy and they want changes. And then when that change cannot be solved, domestically, the politicians would then look at the outside factors. So I think that's completely understandable, given what we're seeing in income inequality. And the other factor is, as Larry mentioned, the China shock. China is rising, soon to become the world's largest economy. Right now, China is the second largest economy. But in the next few years, China will become the largest economy by GDP. And that China shock has had a huge impact on the US. Don't get me wrong, there is a huge impact. But just like NAFTA too, NAFTA had big impact on the United States, but these shocks are fading. There is a transition path after these shocks, right? The economy responds to those shocks by adjusting the structural compositions, the industry compositions, by specializing at the things that we are better at doing in the United States. And if you reverse that, all the sunk costs that we economists call sunk costs are just, paid for unnecessary benefits, right? So that's something I think we need to keep in mind when we redo our policies, to think about, is it really worth redoing our policy given that we already paid for the transition costs to get to this point? Is there anything for us to mitigate the negative consequences and take advantage of the potential win-win situations of these shocks going forward? So that's just my understanding of why we are seeing this at this point. Of course, the election and the candidates has a big role in this as well.
Yeah, I'll add another dimension. I think in addition to income inequality, which is a real issue that needs to be addressed, I think also the political environment in this country, from my perspective, has become increasingly polarized. I mean, both parties are increasingly far to the either to the right or to the left. And I think one of the things that I would be hopeful in a political extent is what we're seeing now is creating sort of more interest. I would call myself an apathetic participant in the political process historically. But what we're seeing today has certainly got my attention and a number of other people that I know. So I think what I'm hopeful about is that the large middle, which is either maybe a little left-leaning or a little right-leaning, but closer together relative to how to constructively solve problems, that polarization has sort of added fuel to the fire in terms of highlighting things like trade in a very negative light. So in addition to the real underlying issues, that issue is contributing as well.
All right, great set of thoughts in answer to the question. I'll ask just one more question, then I'll start fielding some of the audience questions. So one of the proposed political solutions that many of you alluded to is to compensate the losers from trade by providing them with retraining, better education. Sometimes there's advocate for providing better health coverage and other types of welfare benefits to those who've lost out from globalization. But of course, the irony is that many of the people who are the losers from trade are actually also opposed to redistribution, at least by my perception. So how do we resolve that conundrum when the trade losers actually don't want certain forms of compensation from the government?
Stumped us.
Okay, audience questions. No.
That was a stumper.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I guess my view has always been that this election, or it has been that this election reflected frustration as opposed to maybe a rational response. Because the minute that the West Virginian voters, overwhelmingly voted for Trump, and then 2 months later or 4 months later saw his budget, which basically cut all the local industrial revitalization, community revitalization programs in West Virginia, they weren't very happy. So clearly they weren't kind of thinking through maybe all the issues. They were just very frustrated, and they didn't feel that Hillary was going to be the answer to their problems, and they thought that Trump might be. But I don't think they were thinking through this conundrum, as you put it, because same thing happened in the UK, by the way. The main votes for Brexit came from those areas that have the most subsidies.
No more takers? All right.
We agree it's a conundrum.
Therein lies the political gold, if you can resolve that conundrum. Okay, so again, apologies, I've got well over 15 questions here, so I won't be able to get to all of them. But one thing that did not come up at all is the environment. And so the question is, how do you feel that the environmental consequences of industry affect public opinion towards trade? And how can these consequences be most effectively addressed? And then a related question on the environment, how do businesses address the negative effects of the environment? How do businesses address inequality of manufacturing goods overseas and resultant negative effects on the environment? Do they have a moral or ethical responsibility?
Well, I'll take that one. So I think the answer is yes. From our standpoint, what's changing relative to our brand and the way we think about our brand is the way we perceive, our brand is perceived and our products are perceived. Obviously, the issues around climate and climate change and the environment are something that resonate rather broadly around the world. And frankly speaking, for us, it's just good business to be smart about that and to advance our efforts in that area, because not only is there going to be a good resulting effect on the broader ecosystem, frankly speaking, it resonates quite well with the markets we serve. So it's one of these things, it's a virtuous cycle. So as public opinion moves in that direction, which it is, certainly it's the right thing to do, which often is a good motivation, but it's also a profitable thing to do, quite frankly.
I think it's a question that obviously affects my industry with the climate change question. And I think it's what we try to do is promote sustainability and education in this process. You know, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done on climate change. You know, I think the natural gas industry, which is what I primarily work in, has done a terrible job globally in researching methane emissions. And now we're starting to recognize that is a problem, and that's how the coal industry kind of counteracts the gas industry by throwing out these statistics about methane. And in this case, really, the United States is the only country around the world that actually has captured this data. So there's a global initiative now to understand the effects so that we can better promote, you know, the use of cleaner energy. You know, obviously we have this big question on renewables that are coming up. I struggle with the question a little bit because I think there's positives and negatives. One of the questions I had over this past week was that okay, maybe we get some question on climate change, but what do we do with the batteries, you know, with the disposals, et cetera, that we have to deal with the negative consequences of some of the issues that people think about clean air, you know, on this renewable side. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done, but it's got to be taken seriously by the industry, and I think we really do. I think some of the disasters that we have seen in the past, you know, have been largely human nature. So there's obviously training and things, lessons learned that people have done. But I think the industry is taking the steps necessary to deal with this question.
So as one of the victims of the environmental consequences of economic development and globalization, I would like to say that, climate change and, countries' cooperation on climate change has been very important, and we have made a lot of progress. And interestingly, this is actually one of the bonding agents between US and China in the last few years. The two countries have worked together actually on climate change until recently, as you know. I was last time, I was stuck in Beijing airport for over 24 hours because of the smog. We couldn't take off. The plane couldn't take off. So the cost is tremendous, right? When you go through economic development and globalization at such a fast pace, there are all these prices you pay, and in fact, this actually points to my second thought on this, and that is trade agreements sometimes can actually be very useful to promote environmental standards, Trade agreements themselves are often not just trade agreements. They are agreement about everything, like the TPP we had before, what we were negotiating. It's about environmental standards, it's about labor standards, right? It's about intellectual property rights protection. So it's about, it's one of the most credible and enforceable mechanisms to ensure countries' cooperation on these issues that are otherwise very difficult to enforce. So that's why I think we should do more of that. We should have, the so-called higher quality, higher standard trade agreements that allow us to push forward on those fronts that are otherwise, very difficult.
And on that point, I think that's a great one, which is, the environmental anti-trade groups in the 80s and the 90s actually have done a great service for trade because they have focused on the real problem of, essentially the race to the bottom and having industries look for those jurisdictions, those countries which have the least rigorous environmental controls, and they can pollute to their heart's content. Now that obviously is there's limits to what you can do there because obviously the countries don't want that at the end of the day, but they at least highlighted this issue, and because of that pressure, we started putting in those environmental provisions in our free trade agreements starting in the 1990s. So for the last 20 years, that has been a standard feature of all U.S. free trade agreements, including, as Maggie has said, TPP.
Yeah, but I think just in this question, there's a realistic approach to this because, I understand the Beijing question because, I spend a lot of time in Beijing, and I understand, the smog question. But when we look at countries like India, for example, that are starting to make this transition, when we look at Paris climate change, there's got to be an approach, whether it's going to be a top-down driven approach from a governmental perspective on, even though they're a signatory to the Paris climate change, or they're just going to throw it out the door like we've seen a lot what's happened in Europe. When cheap coal came over and the trade from displacement of U.S. shale gas to coal, Germany, who had this huge green program, basically threw all the green carbonization program out the door and bought cheap coal. And that's the same thing I think we face with India. So I think there's a lot of these agreements that we may hopefully wish we see these changes in these trade agreements, but the reality comes up is ultimately, is it going to be an economic question for development? And what we've seen from our perspective within the industry is that a lot of times they throw out these sort of global initiatives, and they tend to lean more towards the economic question, and they tend to buy this dirty burning coal. And so I think there's got to be a trade-off, obviously, but the reality is that sometimes they jump to the economic question more than the climate change question.
Any quick thoughts on this question of whether environmental issues influence public perceptions of trade, public opinion on trade?
Oh, I think the answer is yes. Certainly, in my dealings on the trade side, a lot of those people in the streets in Seattle and in Vienna and around the world, particularly in the 1990s, early 2000s, were there, were environmentalists and that affected very much, I think, the public opinion. It raised questions about trade and the impact. Again, I think, some of that I think was not rational, but some of it was good, and in the end, I thought it was actually, it had a good impact, which was we started taking those kinds of issues into account in our trade agreements.
Okay. Next set of questions has to do with the retraining issue. Washington isn't willing or capable of retraining the Rust Belt workers. That leaves businesses to take the lead. How can this leadership role and effort be energized? And then slightly different take on this, and I think this is a really succinct and nice way of summarizing the issue. Can you train a manual labor to be a software designer?
Well, actually, I think to some degree that actually is possible. So you have to look at what the skill level and difficulty of work is. There's been lots written in terms of how do you layer the talent required to actually do what I'll call low-level programming. And I gave the example in my upfront presentation. So doing maintenance work of equipment and the programming knowledge there is quite rudimentary. So that's required. If you look at an automated factory, what do you have? You have technicians and engineers supporting that. As we deploy that, those are not $200,000 a year software development jobs. Those many times are $60,000 or $70,000 a year technician roles where there is a level of technology requirement, but it's not a level that you need to go on and get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD in some higher level activities. So I think it actually is something that could help offload some of those requirements. I think the retraining efforts are not in the numbers of decades. I think there's actually things like 6 months or 12 months of training could actually bring somebody that has some aptitude to a level of performance.
I mean, I would answer that question and say, what is wrong with being a qualified plumber or electrician, et cetera? I think there's this misunderstanding a lot of times that there's these industries and training programs out there because we're going to always need those types of skill sets, and I think we often overlook if we take statistical averages, and look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the average person to live in a sustainable world is about $14 an hour. So when you get to a salary level of $75,000 to $200,000, except it doesn't really change the level of happiness of your life. And I think sometimes when we look at this technology shift, which it's obviously changed a lot, we often overlook that there's a lot of jobs out there that people just need to be retrained in. I mean, I look around America. I mean, I again, the pleasure of traveling internationally comes back. You have to know something to know something else. You have to see something to get the opposite effect. And every time I come back to the United States, I'm shocked with the level of the infrastructure crumbling around in this country. And, you know, those are the types of jobs that we also need to consider in this world to continue developing this country. You know, I mean, it's terrible going into New York at some of these airports and some of the bridges, et cetera. So I just want to raise a question. It's not only technology that I think is going to be the answer to the solution. I think people need to take a look at some of these hardcore jobs that there are opportunities for people to work.
I want to just add, you know, it's not just the manufacturing jobs that are at risk. You know, there has been some study that calculated offshore ability of different occupations. If, for example, my job can be at risk. I have to compete with my own videos, perhaps some time. You know, my students can take classes from my videos, you know, and I can become obsolete, my occupation, you know. So not every, you know, even services can be at stake. So in fact, plumber's job and electrician's job, my hairdresser's job are safer than mine. You know, you have to, they are non-tradable, right? And so yeah, I think we have to think hard about what we can do to increase our mobility. You know, our mobility across sectors, across occupations, you know, in this world, not just to compete with Chinese workers or Mexican, you know, immigrants, but also to compete with algorithms and robots and automations. And I agree, infrastructure, you know, this is, I mean, I'm again from a country that has invested so much in infrastructure. And the US, if we cannot get infrastructure improved, I mean, how can we do anything about the redistribution? I mean, that's a lot more controversial, in my view. You know, redistributing power and wealth across the population is a lot harder to achieve than agreeing on investing in something as common good as infrastructure. So I think we have to start somewhere, and really be bipartisan, and start working on the things that are important to our future, including infrastructure, including education reforms and tax reforms.
Yeah, there's also a regionalization dimension to this. So if we think about what IBM did in the 60s, they would go into areas that were underdeveloped in terms of employment and technology, but had a very good university environment. So Boulder is a good example of this. IBM put a plant in here, and they tapped into the local educational system. They did that all over the nation. So part of the problem is where you're doing knowledge work. I mean, I can tell you there is no lack of employment in Northern California, and not all of those jobs are software developers, right? So to the extent that certain parts of the country have a deficit and a challenge, there needs to be some policy work and perhaps some incentives for technology companies and other companies that are growing to invest there and to tap into the educational system for talent, because it's one of the bigger challenges we have, because competing for talent in Silicon Valley is terrible. Right, we have an escalating income there, and competing for software engineers is a difficult problem. So we're looking at how do we diversify, and how do we move out, and how do we tap into more of the ecosystem across the country and across the world. So to the extent you do that, you have derivative jobs that are generated in support of that. So I think that's the other dimension that needs to be considered.
Okay, it wouldn't be a trade panel if there weren't a Walmart question. So I'll read the question in a second, but let me frame it by saying that, as many of you said, at the end of the day, the real advantages of trade are to consumers. So is trade fundamentally disadvantaged then, in that people don't see that, or that people downplay that people value that less than a job? Is there something about jobs that are wrapped up in their identity and who they are that makes them overlook any consumer gains? And so the actual question here is, are cheap imported goods from Walmart supposed to be the middle class raise?
Well, Maggie, you want to start, or you
Go ahead.
want? Okay. The alternative is a middle class tax. So if and part of the problem, again, this goes back to the perceptions of trade. People don't really appreciate the fact that they're getting this benefit every day that they go to Costco and to Walmart. But the minute you have a proposal that says, oh, in that case, we'll put a 20% tax called a border adjustment tax on all imports that'll be sold out of Walmart, And then people say, oh, I have to pay a 20% tax at Walmart. Then they don't think it's such a great thing anymore. And they stop worrying about textile jobs in North Carolina. So yeah, as I think it's just a question of immediacy. So it's just a human nature thing, right? If it's something kind of general and you feel sorry for the guy in Ohio, in Youngstown. But then when you're asked to, okay, that's fine. Would you like to increase your taxes by 10% and pay more for your 10% more for everything you buy? We had this thing with the Chinese auto, the tires in the last administration. Everyone paid, I don't know, $300 more for their tires, and we saved jobs at $100,000 a job in the plants in the Midwest. And you know, it's pretty pricey way to save jobs, and so it's immediacy. When you make it, the real question is, an import tariff is a tax. Consumers will pay that tax. Then they have a very different point of view.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Well, first, I think the question needs to shift from a Walmart question to an Amazon question, right? Because that's the next disruption. Yeah, exactly. It's faster, cheaper, and easier to buy from Amazon than it is from Walmart nowadays. But I think just speaking from an industry perspective, as we considered a number of tax policy changes, the border adjustment tax, it was going to be very simple for us because it was going to get passed on directly to the consumer, because there's no way that the companies are not going to take that impact in profit. It's going to be part of the cost basis that gets translated through to the end price of products. So, and I also agree with what Larry said. It's taken for granted that cheap goods are out there, so nobody feels it. You know, it's just sort of there. Whereas jobs and job loss is right there. It's visceral, and people think about it. So. The immediacy question that Larry talked about, I think, is very real. So if everything goes up by 20% the day after tomorrow, I can tell you people will be very concerned about it, in my view.
You know, I was going to raise the question of Amazon more as look at the local stores that are being disrupted in communities. You know, I mean, you go to Barnes & Noble, you want to go buy a book, you go there, you see it, and it's not there. They ask them, can they order it, take 5 days? You say, no, I'll go to Amazon because it'll be there tomorrow. You know, so I think it's not only changed the way people view shopping, but it's also disrupted the local stores in communities. I wanted to just add on a little bit with what Larry was saying about import tax. I mean, in Russia, and I think here's one of the benefits when you come to America. I mean, you can buy automobiles in America at reasonable prices. You go to Russia today, and it's almost 100% import duty on a car. So if you're going to go buy, you know, a $40,000 car, you know, and then you bring it into Russia, the consumer pays $80,000, and that's on a salary basis that are, you know, $1,000 a month average, you know, for knowledge type workers. You know, when you look at buying a home, you know, the mortgage market is almost non-existent. So people save cash. And that's why when you look at that country, even though they have lower income levels, you know, what I've seen over the years is that they're, you know, the old resource curse. They've been so dependent on natural resources that they never really shifted over to value-added industries. And that was something when, you know, in 1999, when we had the shift between Yeltsin and Putin came on in 2000, his goal was to double the GDP by the end of the decade, and he wanted to do that by value added, you know. But when you have commodity prices going from $30 to $150, all those ideas kind of shift away. But I think you know, in reality, import taxes aren't the answer, you know. And I think you're absolutely correct. I think if you started putting these taxes on the American economy, you would see a huge. You think we see, you know, problems with people wanting to buy global trade today? You start putting the tax on, I think you'll see massive people demonstrating that question.
It's exactly the opposite way, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's always a possibility of retaliation, right? When you impose a steep tax on, you know, some country's goods, that country might retaliate against you. And we actually, in our country, had something called, in the US, had something called chicken tax, and I don't know whether you heard of it. It's 25% tariff on light trucks. This has been in place for decades and decades. Why is it called chicken tax? You know, why does it have anything to do with chicken? It's because EU, Germany, had a tax in the 60s, 50s on U.S. chicken. So U.S. retaliated by picking the industry that would hurt Germany the most, and that was light truck, and imposed a 25% tariff on light trucks, and it has stayed in place for all these years. So there is always a trade retaliation going on, and China can retaliate as well. In fact, chicken remains to be one of our weakest links in our economy. And guess what? I will give you one example, which is the example I often give my students: chicken feet. How many of you here eat chicken feet?
Chicken feet, yeah.
Yeah,
right,
chicken feet.
Right.
None, right? So I would raise my hand. Don't judge me, but all Chinese, Chinese consumers love chicken feet, and they are very good. They can be very good. So where do the chicken feet go in the United States? They go to China. So, and if China gets very unhappy with some anti-dumping duty or tariffs from the United States, China can use chicken feet, right? Impose a tariff on U.S. chicken feet or soybean, right? And that can trigger this back and forth retaliation. It happens all the time. So.
Is one of the dirty little secrets of trade in Washington D.C. is those industries which still have protection here in the United States and resulting in higher prices for American consumers, and it includes textiles, autos for the trucks that Maggie just mentioned, dairy, sugar, of course, is a huge one. They have very powerful lobbyists. They're constantly on the Hill. They're constantly at the administration to make sure that those protections do not go away. And so what that means is as a result of their lobbying efforts, they're taking money out of your pockets, going to those corporations in terms of excess profits that they wouldn't normally get in a competitive environment. Those are divided up between labor, management, and shareholders. And I'll leave it to your imagination how that gets divided up. It's the managers who make the decision by the way the house is divided.
To what extent has xenophobia affected attitudes toward international trade?
Well, I think maybe it's the other way around in the sense that if you've lost your job to an import competition, that it's human nature to kind of want to blame a foreign entity on that thing. So I think the fact that we've had the China shock, for example, where we did have a massive adjustment that was required because of again a historically massive amount of trade that occurred. And by the way, the good part of that is I think it was Mike or someone else mentioned, hundreds of millions of Chinese went from abject poverty to middle class, and that's one of the world's great successes is what we've seen in China in the last 25 years, just in terms of reduction of human poverty. But that has meant an adjustment, and so it's not going to be unusual to have anti-foreign feelings come out of that. And that's the responsibility of government and politicians to explain that to voters and try to take measures to mitigate the pain.
So I was one of those people who was alleviated poverty, I guess. So I grew up, when I was a child, we had food stamps. This might sound like very third country. It happened in my childhood. We lived on food stamps for everything, for rice, for flour, for meat. I think less than £1 a month. So that was not true. It was a while ago. I'm not that young anymore, but it was, it was not too long ago. It's in my generation, right? It happened in my childhood. But the country was able to lift millions and millions of people out of poverty, thanks partly to globalization. Obviously, what does that, bring to the United States? Well, the U.S. is also seeing fast economic growth in the last decades. It's just that growth is not evenly distributed. That's the problem. And now the ironic thing is we are seeing the rise of nationalism in both countries, not just the U.S., but also in China, for very different reasons. In the U.S., I would say it's more about economic, incentives and considerations, and then mixed with the politics. In China, I think it's a mix of, how we feel, or now we means Chinese, how we feel that we have been contained, internationally by the West, by the U.S. and allies in terms of our political and economic influence, and how the political system is still not accepted. So there is a lot of tension going on. I mean, I mentioned this on my panel yesterday. There is this tension in both countries, both developed world and developing world. A lot of workers feel in China that they were taken advantage of by the multinational firms, and they were given minimum wage and work in terrible work conditions to produce goods to supply to the American consumers, and yet that was not appreciated. So I think there's a lot of sentiment on both ends, and it is unfortunately the politician's job to actually deal with those sentiments, not to take advantage of the sentiments for their political use. So, and there's not much I can do, but I try my best to to convey the knowledge to my students and to the public whenever I can. But it's the politician's job not to really play the game, to win the election or to get votes, or it's really what is important should be on the agenda, economically to the public, not necessarily the votes.
Larry made a comment before about Brexit and said it wasn't purely trade related, and it was more immigration question. I was in London on a day to vote, and so I was talking to a lot of people. I was in the city of London, obviously the financial world, and just trying to get a sense of what the people's perspective is. And ironically, I for the first time, you talk about the xenophobic, how much anti-Romanian, or anti-Albanian, or Central and Eastern Europeans. I mean, I agree it's an immigration question, but the question extended slightly further because the immigration question was taking jobs away, and this whole idea of the EU, Schengen, visa, trade, free moving around, you had a displacement of people in more or less the Central Eastern European countries that were making their way over towards the more developed UK markets, et cetera, and they were essentially taking jobs away from people in the UK. So I agree it's an immigration question, but that's how I would like some of the issues I've seen of really xenophobic comments, because I always like what's wrong with Romanians? I've other than Transylvania's and the Dracula type stories, et cetera. It was just really strong xenophobic feelings towards these parts of the world because of this movement of people as part of this Schengen EU environment.
Great. Okay, last question. And I've saved this one for last because it's kind of looming over everything and probably a question a lot of people want an answer to. This question, in fact, writes itself so much that the person who asked it didn't even use a complete sentence. And I don't even need to give you a complete sentence, because here it is. Repercussions of Trump on trade, ? Someone else actually elaborated a bit more. Please discuss the likelihood of a border adjustment tax, and if it happens, how will businesses adjust or deal with it?
There you go, Mike.
Well, that was pretty, I partially answered that. So I think the sentiment for a border adjustment tax is declining rapidly. I don't think it will happen. And I think we talked about why. Because it's going to be a direct translation through to the consumer. So it sounds good perhaps during the political season, because this is how we're going to move forward the protectionist agenda. But certainly from our standpoint, we're doing a lot of contingency planning around the new administration's potential both regulatory tax actions. And so from a business standpoint, it's very little you can do other than contingency plan, because at this point we don't know what's going to happen. It's been changing very rapidly. So obviously we spend a lot of time and energy and resource trying to think through a wide range of potential policy actions. But at this point, relative specifically to border adjustment tax, we would, although we're prepared for it in one of those contingencies, I think there's very little probability that it happens.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think just generally, I think this is one of those areas where it's really good that a president doesn't necessarily follow through on all his campaign promises, and so because we're seeing so far in the administration some pretty standard types of approaches, right? So you have already, you've had, of course, bilateral summits now with three of the major traders with the United States, Germany, China, and Japan. And at least on the economic side, all three of those meetings went actually pretty smoothly. On the personal side, not so smoothly with Merkel, but certainly with Xi and Abe in all respects quite smooth. And the approach to trade for both Japan and China is actually very much the standard way. Setting up these comprehensive dialogues to look at a bunch of different kinds of issues, and they'll look for common ground. And it doesn't look like, and eventually for the U.S. and Japan, for example, I think there will be a movement towards the end of this year, hopefully, to a bilateral free trade agreement that will essentially kind of replace and provide a mechanism to move forward with what we lost on the TPP. So it's actually, it's not all gloom and doom, I think, on the trade front. The people that he's got in the cabinet, Wilbur Ross is he understands the value of open markets. Robert Lighthizer, who's going to be the trade representative, knows trade very well. He's not a knee-jerk protectionist, and Mnuchin in Treasury is also a free trader. So he's got kind of standard people. There's some crazies in White House as well on trade, but so far they have not had much impact on, at least on the meetings that have related to trade so far.
So as a trade economist, I have to say my mood has, or my sentiment has gone up and down in the last few months, and now I'm at a high point. So hopefully I'll remain at that point for a while, as Larry suggested. Things are looking a little bit more hopeful now and a little bit more optimistic, and including the U.S.-China relationship. I was watching that very closely, and there was tweet before the meeting, and there was no tweet after the meeting. And that to me was a good sign. Right, no tweets are probably good. So that's the first thing I checked in the morning, after the meeting. So I'm remaining hopeful. I should just stop here, I guess.
I mean, I look at it, there was a statistics in the Wall Street Journal that said from 2008 to 2015, the U.S. economy grew at the lowest rate of 1.5, 1.6%. So I'm not sure Obama has done a great job himself in economic development. I mean, I think what we see in Trump's position right now, and I think "Make America Great Again," that slogan, I think what he wants to do is take the regulatory side out. Make decisions that are market driven, and see if we can make some changes. Now, it may not be the right solution, but I think we have to give them a chance to see if we can see some economic changes. And I think, when I look at Germany, for example, in the EU, I mean, some of the problems that we see through this whole, possibly fracturing of the EU is Germany's an export-oriented country, forcing countries like Greece, et cetera, to buy goods and pay for goods, et cetera, that they can't afford. And so I'm not sure if we can sit back and say that free trade has always worked perfectly, and I think there's a lot of problems that we have to deal with. But I think America should just give this person a chance to see if he can bring some of these jobs back. And I agree a little bit. I think a lot of it, the promises of job reintegration back in America will not happen. But we have come out of a low period of time, and I think we just have to heal the country, the divide, and see if we can move forward with economic development, job creations, et cetera, better foreign diplomacy, and hopefully heal some of the wounds that obviously were, as Mike said, the polarization of the political spectrum. I mean, I attended an event last night, and I was shocked to hear the senator of Colorado at the very end make a statement that Russia is our enemy. I mean, blatant statement of that nature, and that whole discourse, that whole political discourse, is not going to help the global world. Is not going to help this whole issue of trade. So I think, you know, we need to take a break, take a step back, and hopefully some of these divides become healed, and we can move forward with economic development and truly make America great again, and bring some jobs back, and bring economic development, reduce some of this income inequality, et cetera.
All right, thank you very much, and a round of applause for our 4 wonderful panelists. Thanks all for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I think we're in this, are you doing the trade one next time too? Another trade panel.
Oh, where?
Yeah, we're on the together, yeah. So a lot of together, yeah. So together, yeah. So